Kadima.
Hello, welcome. My name is Efrat Perry. I'm the head of public diplomacy department at the Israeli Embassy. And I would like to welcome you to this session of the first World Gaelic Week, Seachdain Gaelic. I hope I got that right. So we are very honored to take part in this very special event. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to explore the connection between Hebrew and Gaelic, especially, and this is something that I just learned while we were working on this event, that the study of Hebrew, the method Ulpan, as we call it, was taken by Scotland as a way to learn, to study and learn Gaelic. So I find it very, very intriguing and also inspiring to see the connection between our two cultures and our two people. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Nivi Naor and Joy Dunlop, and for them to continue to start this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, and please, we have at the end time for Q&A, so please make sure to write your questions at the box. Thank you.
Tafalav Efrat, thank you very much. I guess ha uabs snog vi chudjach agus vi nur chudjach is a cholaver show. It's lovely to be here involved with this chat. For anybody that doesn't know me, my name is Joy Dunlop. I am the director of Seachdain Gaelic, and I work predominantly with Gaelic language across range of different opportunities. I do a lot in the media and I sing in Gaelic, and I come from Argyll, which is an area that was steeped in language and culture, but over the years has definitely lost its language and is making an attempt, like most of Scotland, to bring Gaelic back and to reintroduce it to our communities. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here for this conversation. And this is the first time that I have met Nivi. We don't know each other at all, so it would be wonderful if you could introduce yourself to not only just me, but anybody that is watching this at home.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So my name is Nivi Naor. I'm currently living in London for the past 6 years, but before that, I've lived my entire life in Israel. And I'm what you would call a Hebrew enthusiast. I studied Hebrew literature, children literature, Hebrew linguistics. I was a Hebrew editor and content manager for many years. Unfortunately, that's not so much in demand here in London. So now I'm actually in data analytics and not so much into Hebrew anymore. But I'm still very intrigued by it. I follow, I guess, more Hebrew media than Hebrew and Israeli media than British and English one. Mm-hmm. So still keep a lot in touch with my heritage, so to say. I come from a family of Hebrew enthusiasts as well. My great-great-grandfather was a contemporary of Eliezer ben Yehuda during the revival of Hebrew, and he was also an author and a journalist. Also did a little bit of journalism in the day, and yeah, that's about it, I guess, for now.
Oh, wonderful. And there might be people watching this that know nothing about the Hebrew language at all. So can you give us a wee introduction?
Okay, so first of all, Hebrew is a Semitic language, which means we write it from right to left, similar to Arabic or Aramaic, Persian, a few others. We have 22 letters of the alphabet. All of them are used as consonants, although 4 of them can also be used as vowels. But we don't normally use vowels when we write. We have 2 sets of alphabets, print letters or block letters, and cursive letters, similar to English. But we also have additional graphic signs, which we call nikud, or punctuation, although we also have punctuation marks, that are used within the words instead of vowels. Mm-hmm. So we have a set of 12 different simanei nikud, but then after you're first taught how to read and write Hebrew, you discard them altogether and you don't use the nikud anymore, 90% of what you write and read in everyday life don't have it. So it might be very confusing. And sometimes you need to guess the way to pronounce a word just by its context, because the same word can have different ways of pronunciation. Like if you have 3 consonants, one after the other, one for S, one for F, one for R, it can be sefer, which is a book. It can be sapal, which is a barber. It can be safar, which is to count. It can be sfar, which is frontier. It can be siper, which is told something, and so on and so forth. So if you're not familiar with the language, you might have a little bit of problem at first, and you have to gather like a lot of information from the sentence itself, its syntax, its grammar. This can lead to a lot of double meanings. This can lead to what you'd call a garden path sentences. There's a very famous saying when you study Hebrew linguistics, chulza metayelet bavadi. Chulza meaning was rescued, but also a t-shirt. Metayelet, which is someone who is on a trip, but also a trip itself, and vadi. So you start reading this sentence, and it's about a t-shirt taking a trip, and only when you reach the vadi in the river, you understand that it's actually that someone who took a trip was rescued.
Oh, okay.
So the meaning really, really depends on the context.
That's fascinating. I think what's interesting as a Gaelic speaker is Gaelic's a Celtic language, and for most of us, our first language English speakers, they're totally different construction-wise. We only have 18 letters in our alphabet, but we make up other letters by combining consonants or combining vowels or using an accent, using without an accent. And for us, it tends to be the vowels that can change the meaning of the words. So having a long vowel compared to a short one will change the meaning. So for example, bata is a stick, but bata is a boat. One is going to get you across the ocean better than the other. And we have a lot of different words that sound the same. And as a learner coming in, it can be quite tricky. English is quite syllabic also. Everything we say is very correct, whereas Gaelic is all about the push and the pull and the rhythm of the language. And it sounds like you're singing in a lot of ways due to the rise and fall. And your inflection is so important to get that natural feel. Do you have that kind of thing also in Hebrew as well? Is the delivery an important part of learning?
I think what we have similar to Gaelic is some consonants or sounds that don't exist in other languages. It doesn't really sound like singing. It sounds like more like coughing in Hebrew, like chet and ayin, and the Hebrew reish, which is very different from the English R.
Yeah. We have 4 L sounds in Gaelic and different lenited R's and rolled R's and soft ones. So the ghiz and the chiz and the chiz are sounds that I recognise well, as you're saying. And it is about retraining your mouth and I guess just getting used to how you try and then work with what you have in English and translate it. And I don't know, it can be quite difficult with Gaelic to translate from one language to the other because the sentence structure is so different, but also because just the way you construct sentences and the way you construct imagery is so different. I don't know if you have similar problems or challenges, difficulties when translating maybe Hebrew into English or vice versa.
So the syntax is pretty similar to English. We don't have the same tenses. Like we don't use past perfect or present perfect. We have past, we have present, we have future. It doesn't get much more complicated than that. So in a sense, when you try to translate Hebrew into English, you have to kind of dig deeper into the meanings and understand whether this present should be present simple or present progressive or present perfect. And what exactly does the writer refer to when they're just using the Hebrew present? So yeah, it might be challenging in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Also, but what is easier when translating, Hebrew is a gendered language. So every verb and every noun has a female form and a male form. So when you translate it into English, you just get rid of all of that and just one form for all.
We have exactly the same in Gaelic. And actually, it's when you go the other way, when you're going English into Gaelic, particularly as a learner, that is where the interesting language points come in, because it's not obvious to us quite often, the gender of a word. And for example, the word bodhanach, which means woman, is a masculine word. So bodhanach mód, a large woman, the tall woman, you would think maybe would be bodhanach vód to show that it's a feminine. So despite the fact you're talking about a female, it is still a masculine word. And it's these subtle nuances that can be quite tricky when you're learning a language. Anyway, if it's a similar language, but when it is a different root language, it can be totally different. I wonder if you could teach us, or me in particular as I'm here, but anybody that's watching this, a few simple phrases so we can just hear the sounds.
Yeah, sure. Let's start with the really basics, like I speak Hebrew, אני מדברת עברית, which is the female form. If you want to use the male form, זה אני מדבר עברית, מדבר instead of מדברת. I love studying languages. אני אוהבת ללמוד שפות. I'm trying not to use a lot of ch and ein.
Oh no, more of that's better.
We just had a holiday last week, Purim, which is kind of our Mardi Gras. So when it's a holiday, you would say Chag Sameach, happy holidays. And then you would answer Chagim Uzmanim L'Sason, happy times and holidays.
I love that.
Yeah.
And there is a sing-song quality to it. There's a rise and a fall, a cadence in the language that I guess as a speaker you don't even think about, but you can hear that. To my ear anyway, it does sound very melodic.
Probably from what I hear from non-native or non-speakers who listen to Hebrew, they say we always sound angry. So I don't know if that's true or not. Most of us are not angry all the time, but there's something about kind of the sharp consonants we use that probably reflects on that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess delivery is, if you're more excited, it might come across as possibly angrier as well. But that push and pull, for me, is fascinating, because even if we were talking about Gaelic in English, you'll hear Gaelic, but Gaelic, these long vowels. So Stillam Gaelic, I like Gaelic. Sfeed Hullum Gaelic, da dum. It's that push, that pull of the language. And if I wanted to introduce myself very, very simply in Gaelic, I could just say, Is Misha Joy? I am Joy. Is Misha Joy? Are there any simple introductions I can learn in Hebrew?
Yeah, so the same. I'm Nivi, Ani Nivi. My name is Nivi. The Hashem Sheli Nivi, Shmi Nivi.
Shmi Joy, Smisha Joy.
Yeah. Maybe there's some ancient origin. But you could also say Korim li Nivi. They call me Nivi. Nice to meet you. נעים מאוד. נעים לפגוש אותך.
Sma cynnych grúcht. Sma docynnych. Nice to meet you. And interestingly, she joy in Tiny Mahoram. It is Joy that's the name that is on me. If you want to be a wee bit more formal, say my name is she Joy in Tiny Mahoram. It is Joy, that is the name that's on me. And it's getting these different constructions initially that can be quite tricky, but that's what gets you into the language. Going back to obviously, Hebrew was a language that was used, but maybe fell out of use is probably the politest way to say it. Can you tell us a wee bit about that history side of the language?
Yeah, so about 2,000 years ago, Jews that were in the land of Israel or Palestine, whatever you want to call it, not getting into any political issues there, but there was no state of Israel, so it is the land of Israel or Palestine. So Jews were scattered all over the world and had to adapt wherever they ended up to speaking whatever language that was spoken there. Hebrew was then only left as a holy language. This was the language that you prayed in, the language that you read the Bible in, and you studied the Bible, but that's it. Nobody was using it in day-to-day life. The greatest minds of Judaism, Maimonides didn't write in Hebrew, and all the great rabbis, they each wrote in their own respective languages, whether it being German or French or Arabic or Persian or whatever. And then roughly 150 years ago, when Zionism started as a movement of going back into Israel and starting again a Jewish entity within Israel, they came upon deciding that we want also a language that will unite us as a new people. And Hebrew was the obvious choice, being it the holy language, but then it had to be adapted into modern life because there was no word for electricity in Hebrew because there was no electricity when the Bible was written. And Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was the revival of Hebrew and his contemporaries, he was not the only one, obviously, had to come up with all this new vocabulary and start teaching people on how to use it. And this was probably a very long and tedious process, but 50 years later, when the state of Israel was founded, it was the proclamation of independence was in Hebrew, and that was already the language that everybody spoke in everyday life. So in that sense, it was a huge success.
And that is fascinating, particularly from a Gaelic speaking perspective. When we were an oral language, Gaelic was an oral language, a spoken language passed down through generations, and definitely we're still encountering the same problems of not having vocabulary for new, particularly technological advances. We had to obviously make the word for electricity or the internet or the television. Was Hebrew still a written language, though, with it being a religious language? Was it one that people could still read and write?
It was, yeah. People were taught how to read and write it just so they can read the Bible. But there wasn't any literary corpus written in Hebrew. Poems and stories were only started to be written in Hebrew late 19th century or mid-late 19th century. And if you read it now, it's very, very archaic Hebrew that you won't use today. So Hebrew developed a lot during the last, say, 100, 150 years. If you read all these early works, you see a lot of references to biblical text or very ancient text, because that's the only Hebrew people knew. And as it goes on, authors and journalists and editors started incorporating new words and new formations of sentences that will allow them to write for everyday life. And now most people probably won't understand these archaic formations.
Yeah. Everything you're saying is making sense to me as a Gaelic speaker, and we definitely, I would say, still hark back to that beautiful native way of writing. And the Gaelic Bible for many people is where you see that pure language and beautiful sentence structure. And in some ways, it does feel, it's a higher register and it feels a wee bit more old-fashioned, but that was how people spoke. You mentioned that successfully Hebrew was reintroduced and is now spoken. How, though, did you do that?
This was mainly done through schools and through educators. I mean, you had a whole generation who were taught a mother tongue that none of their mothers spoke. Nobody was a native Hebrew speaker 100 years ago. When my great-great-grandfather came from Belarus to Israel, he only knew how to read and write Hebrew. He didn't speak it. And then slowly it started. He was one of the first Hebrew teachers in Tel Aviv. He was also the first lifeguard in Tel Aviv, but that's a whole different story. And then his children already went to school knowing how to speak Hebrew, but had to learn how to read and write Hebrew. And throughout the last 100 and so years, with the waves of immigration arriving in Israel, each generation had to start from scratch. And older people, younger people, children, they all had to learn it first as a second language, and then the new generations finally had it as their native tongue.
And was that when the Ulpan method of teaching really came to the fore?
Yes. So Ulpan is the way new immigrants are taught when they arrive in Israel. It is state-sponsored, and within approximately 3 weeks, people start to speak Hebrew, which is amazing. This is compared, like when I moved to the UK, I had 2 daughters. The eldest was 3. And it was the first time that I actually was able to see the process of acquiring a new language. She went into preschool, and 3 weeks later, she spoke English.
Yeah.
The same happens in Ulpan, but not only with children who are at that age where they can acquire a language, but at a much older age where you're not supposed to be able to pick up new languages, and yet Ulpan does it within 3 weeks.
Yeah. And we can talk a wee bit about Ulpan in particular from the Gaelic side, but for anybody that is watching this and thinking, I don't know how that happens, I don't know anything about that method of teaching, can you describe the pedagogy behind it?
Not in too much detail, as I've never been to Ulpan myself, having been born and Hebrew being my native tongue.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, it kind of teaches you not just the principle of language, but the principle of speaking it and using it in everyday life. So you don't start with grammar and syntax and build up like when you learn a foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
You start with what you need in everyday life. You listen to the news, you hear the music, you speak to people on the street. And from there, you build up to the more general concept of a language.
Mm-hmm. And Scottish Gaelic speakers or even learners in Scotland, or those maybe with no Gaelic at all, possibly will recognise the Ulpan method of teaching as it was adapted as a way to teach Welsh. And then it was the Welsh course was adapted as a way to teach Scottish Gaelic. And I trained as an Ulpan teacher, and I found it fascinating because it was very much an oral type of learning, using your ears, repeating sentences over and over and over again, and then using them in whether it was a game or an activity. And people were doing that without seeing the language. It was very much trusting your ears and trusting your speech, which is hard as an adult learner. We are so used to having a security blanket of something in front of us. And I'm a note taker. You know, I like to take notes. I like to have memory aids. And when we did our training, we did it in Welsh. And it was scary putting yourself in that position where you did not know what was being said. You didn't understand. You just heard the sounds and repeated the sounds and heard the sounds and repeated the sounds. But it does make you focus. And I can still remember Gwendoffy coffee, you know, I would like a coffee, that we learned then. So it obviously works. But I guess maybe the biggest difference is we were doing it as 2 classes. You did an 1.5-hour class per week, whereas in Israel it was very much an immersive environment. People were learning classes but then going out into the community and trying to use it.
Yeah, definitely. That is the whole purpose, to let people get out of class and go order a coffee at the next coffee shop.
Yeah.
And essentially, it didn't even matter what language you knew from home or from the country you immigrated from. Mm-hmm. Like you could have in one class people speaking 15 different languages, and they all end up with Hebrew as a common language.
Yeah. And it is phenomenal just to think that it went from having no speakers, you know, to be alive in books and particularly in historical texts, to being totally revived. And you're saying you're a first language learner, a first language speaker in, was it 50 years, you said, 40 years?
The Hebrew Language Committee was founded in 1890. Mm-hmm. My grandfather was born 1927. Wow. His first language was already Hebrew.
Wow.
Although Israel, Palestine was still under British mandate, English and Hebrew, along with Arabic, were all present in everyday life already. Mm-hmm. So it was very rapid once, you know, it started going. There were a lot of struggles to begin with, whether Hebrew should become a spoken language or still remain only as a holy language. A lot of religious circles were against starting to use this holy language in everyday life. And one of the quotes was, "I don't want to go to the bathroom," in Hebrew.
Yeah.
But yeah, it caught up, definitely.
And it just shows what can be done in, well, there's 30 years, talk about your grandfather. I mean, for me, this is a very obvious question, but why are historical languages so important? What role does Hebrew play in the lives of Jewish people?
Well, in the lives of Jewish people, there's absolute connection between religion and language. The language of Judaism is Hebrew, and the religion of Hebrew is Judaism. It goes hand in hand. But even if you don't think specifically about Hebrew, I think conserving all these ancient languages, these are the basis of human culture and human civilizations. I mean, the Epos of Gilgamesh was written in a language that nobody speaks now, and the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in language that for years nobody spoke. And this is the way to preserve our heritage as the human race, being able to understand these creations, these literature works in their original language and the way they were actually written. I mean, if you look at all these extinct languages now, Navajo being almost extinct and so on, in a few years, nobody will understand, nobody will be able to decipher what was written in these languages. And that's a loss for us as a race.
Absolutely.
Human race.
I always feel, because we, obviously in Scotland, we are working at reviving Gaelic, and it is a minority language, although there are so many of us that use it in our working lives, in our home lives, and we're very passionate about it. But there are obviously a lot of people who've born and brought up in Scotland without the language and do not see a link to their daily lives. And I look at our place names that are rooted in Gaelic. Even if you're not a Gaelic speaker, you'll know that you'll recognise Glencoe, for example, Gleown you know, it's a Gaelic name. Loch Ness, Loch Nish is a Gaelic name. So many of our place names they came from Gaelic. The turns of phrases that we say in English, even smashing for very good, comes from ismashin in Gaelic. You know, the link that's there to language, to culture, to our heritage, even if you're not a speaker, to me, are just so obvious that I can't understand why anybody might not think that they're relative to their lives today.
Yeah, I think this is more relevant in these days to Yiddish than in Hebrew, because when Hebrew was not used, it was only used as a holy language. The Jewish people living in Eastern Europe developed their own kind of dialect, Yiddish, which borrows from Hebrew and German. And ever since Hebrew became a spoken language again, it's being spoken by less and less people with every generation. Nowadays, only ultra-Orthodox, almost only ultra-Orthodox people speak Yiddish, and it's the same as Scottish languages. It's becoming more and more scarce now, with people not understanding why we should preserve it.
Yeah. And could you understand Yiddish if you hear it being spoken?
Very, very few words. A lot of Yiddish words became Hebrew phrases as well. So we use a lot of words in Yiddish in our everyday life. Some people use it as Hebrew words without even realizing that it's originally in Yiddish, like tachles, which is "come on, let's go," or I don't know, a lot of words that none of them come to mind at the moment. A lot of food dishes are from Yiddish. A lot of slang is from Yiddish, but Yiddish as a language. If I speak, my grandmother used to speak Yiddish. It was her first language, so I picked up a little bit, but unfortunately, I can't understand it. My dad still understands a little bit.
Yeah, so interesting. I do see that people are sending us questions, and maybe if it's all right, we'll go to them at the end. Possibly we'll swoop round, and that gives folk time if they do want to ask anything, then they can put that in the chat. But just carrying on talking about language revitalization. It sounds like such a strong term, a dead language, but when you talk about revival, it feels that much more positive. I guess coming from the Gaelic side of it, Gaelic is still a living language, although it is spoken by more and more, particularly young people now. And we're thrilled that Duolingo, the app, the learning app now, you can learn Gaelic on Duolingo, and they've just published that over 1 million people have signed up, started the Gaelic language course when the last census said we had 60,000 speakers. So comparatively, I mean, that's a huge jump for us. And we're taking that as a massive sign of progress. But do you think that actually Gaelic, being a living language still, has maybe affected the way that we've approached language revival compared to your efforts where you just had to start from the ground up and fully embrace it?
Yeah, I think Gaelic has a much better starting point, with people actually still speaking it and still adapting modern life into the language and language into modern life. I mean, you don't have to come up with a whole new word for electricity. You can just think about how to incorporate it within an existing language. So yeah, I think obviously the more people learn it and the more people use it in everyday life, not just when reading and writing, but when ordering a coffee, that's the way to preserve a language. It's great that you can publish literature and magazines and journals, and you have an app for learning language, but if you don't use it in everyday life, it will eventually die. That's what happened to Hebrew.
Yeah, and it's both inspiring and depressing, I think, listening to when you're saying there, it's in some ways Gaelic is in a much more positive situation because you have speakers, and I'm talking to you who speaking Hebrew, a language that has been totally revived in 30 years, and we are still working 30 years later here on Gaelic revitalization. It is both it's both inspiring but also quite depressing that we're not making the same progress.
Yeah, I think part of it is due to the fact that when all these immigrants came to Israel, they didn't have a common language. So they couldn't just rely on, like we do now, in English and have Hebrew as a side language or as a hobby. They had to have a language that they will be able to communicate with each other. And Hebrew was the obvious choice because they all knew how to read and write Hebrew, even not to speak it.
Yeah.
And also, another important factor is that the organizations, the political parties, they all adopted Hebrew as the language of their communications. If Scottish Parliament will decide to only use Scottish language as the official language, a lot more people will start using it.
Yeah. Oh, and you're totally correct. I mean, we have Gaelic currently as a recognised language of Scotland, but it's not an official. We're not a bilingual country, and it definitely limits what you can do, particularly from a political side, but also it's that top-down thinking that it doesn't have to be the language that people use, and you don't have to produce materials in that language. You can, but you don't have to, and that is the difference. I hadn't actually realised, this is probably my ignorance, that, I mean, obviously I know that Israel comprises people of many diverse cultural backgrounds, but around 34 languages are spoken in addition to Hebrew. Is that
officially,
right?
there's probably more, yeah.
Yeah.
Because we have immigrants from every country in the world, you'll probably find speakers of every language in the world in Israel, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And do you find that you're having, particularly in a modern day situation, those languages are impacting Hebrew that's spoken? Do you get slang words coming in?
Definitely. Hebrew has borrowed words from other languages ever since it was created 2,000 years ago. I mean, a lot of words were borrowed because even then we didn't have a vocabulary for everything. So the word for orchard, pardes, comes from Greek, and other words come from Persian and Turkish and Arabic. And in modern times, obviously, a lot more words come from English. So every Israeli will say bye at the end of the conversation, and not necessarily litraot, which is the Hebrew word, and we'll say yalla, which is in Arabic, instead of kadima or let's go or whatever. And especially with technology progressing so fast that the language can't keep up with it, we use a lot of technical terms, like there is a Hebrew word for the internet. It's called mirshetet, but nobody uses it. The Academy for the Hebrew Language tries to come up with new terminology for all these words. Mm-hmm. So an app is yisumon, and a text message is misron, and a podcast is hesket. And these words are in use, but they're not very common, and most people will still use the English term just because it was there before.
Yeah. Oh, we have that as well, definitely. And there is always the question of how natural does it feel? And the word for a fridge, for example, a fridge freezer, a fuariter, which really just means a thing that makes it cold. Fuar is the word for cold. So a fuariter, colder, I guess, a freezer, a fridge. But for some reason, that feels really clunky. But for me, a rohiter for a freezer, I learned as a word. So it's an odd one that I say, oh, cushion's a fridge, like stick that in the fridge. That feels very natural for me to use the English, but I would say cushion is a rohiter, stick that in the freezer. And it's fascinating when you look at how you come to a language and as you were saying, what's the first time you heard it? What language is that in? It becomes the one that sticks. And definitely with modern technology,
it's funny because in Hebrew, it's exactly the opposite. You would use the Hebrew word mekarer for refrigerator, but you would use freezer for a freezer, even though we have makpi.
Mm-hmm. And it must be something to do with ease of speech and just being something being in use. I mean, Etherlian for us is the internet, and that's very commonly used. But I remember being in school, I learned Gaelic as a second language. My parents didn't speak Gaelic. We didn't have it spoken in the community or in my primary school. But when I went to secondary school, we could do it as a second language. And just at that time in that school, you had to learn French. Everybody had to learn French. And we had the choice, did we learn Gaelic or German also for our first 2 years? And I remember doing Gaelic and our standard grade exams that everyone who'd done 4 years of second language learning, we all did these standard grades. And when I came out, I distinctly remember saying to my teacher, there was a question I just didn't understand. There was a word in there I didn't understand. And we were looking at it afterwards. I was like, what is that one? She said, oh, Etherlian. That's the internet. And I mean, the internet was still sort of new-ish, I guess, for us. I mean, I only got a computer around about that time so I could start writing my school essays. But we hadn't ever learned in school the word for internet. Etherlian hadn't come up in anything we'd been learning. So when it appeared in the exam, we were all totally stumped. But I mean, that was 20 years ago. Now there's not a child or an adult that's not going to know the word Etherlian.
It's really interesting that such a word existed back then. I mean, I guess the Hebrew word mirshetet was only developed like years afterwards.
Well, I think similar to what you're saying, we had at that point during the Gaelic Orthographic Convention where it was a group of academics that came together to standardise written Gaelic, particularly for exams and for Gaelic medium education, which is still for us a relatively new, I guess. If you look at the whole history of Gaelic medium education is only about 40 years old. So that is new. And when it came to standardization with writing, all of a sudden people had to standardize the spellings and create new words, particularly for education. So the internet clearly came in there. It clearly hadn't come to our Gael though, because we were still totally thrown about that. But it is fascinating how you transfer, particularly an older language, to a modern day word when it's a minority language as well. Podcast for one. We have a word, podchrúlach, but without a doubt, you hear people saying, oh, yesh, a podcast. They just use the English in the Gaelic construction. And I don't know if that happens for you as well.
Yeah, the same. Shamati podcast ayom. I heard the podcast today. Yeah, nobody. I wouldn't say Shamati hesket ayom. My mom might say that, but not me.
Does it just feel too formal?
It doesn't even spring to mind when I think about what I want to say, because I've been listening to podcasts for, 15 years, and the word only came 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So I have a 10-year gap. Maybe, younger people that will only start now listening to podcasts will use the Hebrew word. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, we'll see in a couple of years.
Mhm. And we've been doing broadcasts all this week as part of Seachdain Gaelic, and a big subject that's come up in every single one has obviously been the COVID pandemic. And for the last 2 years, most of us have been at home on our own, not being part of our community. And for us, that is so important. But actually, I guess the one silver lining of the lockdown is that Gaelic online and the online Gaelic community has exploded, and I see people using Gaelic online more than I ever have before. Is the same true for Hebrew?
I don't know if more people are using Hebrew, but switching into online and virtual events sure helped me personally, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, to connect with Hebrew culture in Israel, because I don't have to physically be there, and I can listen to lectures and watch movies and like I can't go to the Israeli cinema here, but there are movie festivals online, so I can watch Israeli movies. And yeah, that's been great. That's a lot more accessible than it used to be, especially living here and not in Israel.
And do you think that's something that's going to continue in the future? Because definitely that is our feeling, this hybrid form of working. Because, I mean, if we had the choice to be there in person, everybody would, but geography doesn't become a barrier when you can stream it online or you can hold events like this. So definitely it feels like it's the feeling for us is that, oh, this is going to continue and it's a good thing. Do you get a similar feeling?
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope that they can still, attend virtual events from Israel in Hebrew and enjoy the Hebrew culture here in London.
Mm-hmm. And what other languages have you learned yourself?
I speak Hebrew, English, Arabic, French. I can read Russian, but I can't speak it. I know a little bit of German, a little bit Spanish, a little bit Italian.
Oh my goodness. It's always so mortifying coming from Scotland because most of us speak one language or two, and you speak to anybody from anywhere else. And I mean, that must have been about 8 there that you could do a great job on. But looking from learning, obviously you didn't learn Hebrew, that was your first language, but from learning other languages, what do you think that we can learn from that? As a Gaelic's, we're trying so hard to bring back Gaelic and to make it relevant. From learning a language from the start, what sort of tips and hints do you think that we could learn from?
So, like we mentioned already, first thing that comes to mind is use the language. Don't learn it just to be able to read, I don't know, the Epics of Gilgamesh in its original language. Learn how to speak in everyday life so you can watch television. Watch television. If you want to see how people actually use the language, find movies or podcasts or television show or whatever in that language, because this is how you catch up on most. This is how I learned English, to be honest. I just watched television. And also, I would put a lot of emphasis on pronunciation, especially in Hebrew and in Gaelic. It sounds so different than most other languages. Pronunciation is key. If you know how to say ein or het or reish, you're way ahead than other people who are struggling with pronouncing reish and het and ein in English accent.
No, that's so true. And as a Gaelic learner, it's interesting. I came to Gaelic through music. So I sang in Gaelic before I could speak any Gaelic. We have something called the Royal National Mod, which is our big competitive Gaelic music festival. And it's my favourite time of the year. I get to go to a small, there's a wee circuit of places, but I get to go somewhere and for a week I meet all my Gaelic friends. Everybody that's involved in music and language, they are there at some part of that week. And I speak Gaelic the whole week. But that was my introduction. Gaelic came to Oban, which is the nearest town to, I come from a small village called Connell. And there was a Gaelic speaker from one of the islands in our village who said, if anybody wants to learn, any of the children want to learn singing, come and see me. So we would go on a Monday afternoon after school to Mrs. Pollock's house, and we all went together en masse because we were a tiny primary school. So all of us was, I think, 8 of us, and we learned the songs, and having that grounding in the language just meant that when I started learning it as a language, I thought, I know how these words are supposed to sound because I had already sung them. And I remember her teaching us about, we don't have that d and t sound that you have in English, that hard, I got the snare drum sound, that s. We don't have that in Gaelic. You stick your tongue behind your top teeth, so you get a th and a d. And she was really strict about the different L sounds. So even from when we were very small, we were doing our luz versus our liz versus our yiz. And that was something that we learned. But I see, particularly for adult learners who come at it, where you realize that they're a learner is the sounds aren't quite there, because you have to retrain your face and your mouth and your tongue, and the rhythm of the language as well, that long, short, long is so important. And I don't know what it's like in Israel, but there's definitely, I understand that it can be quite hard for a native speaker sometimes to listen to a learner butchering their sounds, even though they're trying so hard. And getting that balance of enthusiasm and patience can be tricky sometimes. I don't know if it's obviously, with it being a first language for you, it's not been an issue. But do you see that with people that are trying to learn Hebrew?
Yeah, I think Hebrew speakers, Israelis, I don't know if it's more the language thing or the country thing, are really enthusiastic about people trying to speak Hebrew. So we would go out of our way just to help people pronounce things properly, or learn new words, or fine-tune their grammar if they're trying to speak. Israelis are really, really helpful in this sense. If you try and speak Hebrew and they see that you are really doing your best, but you're failing, they will usually help you get over this barrier.
We were actually having a wee conversation earlier about the understanding on both sides, that for the native speaker, it is so, enthusiastically encouraging people to try and, politely steering them in the right direction. But as a learner, it's also understanding that native speakers aren't there just for you to talk to and to ask questions about grammar. And it's having that shared relationship, but it's getting to know people and doing that through the language in a way that everybody's comfortable with is the key to good communication.
Definitely, yeah.
I am seeing there's a few questions coming in, and I'm just kind of also keeping an eye on the time. So I wonder if it's all right, we'll just go through a few of these now to make sure I don't miss anybody. So I'll just very quickly going through these. Some are about Hebrew, some are about Gaelic. So I'll just start at the top and work down from which way am I going? I have to work out which is the one that was the one in first. I think it's this one here. Gillian Moss is saying she's Scottish but lives in England, has been learning Gaelic on Duolingo, but has had no opportunity to talk to anybody in Gaelic. Do I know if there are online conversational classes? And I don't know if that's maybe a similar situation for you, but people, particularly if you're out with Scotland, really struggle with the conversation side of it. I would say to check out the learngaelic.scot website. It's a one-stop shop for information about Gaelic conversation in particular, but also about any types of Gaelic classes that are out there. There are online conversational classes, and we'll see if we can maybe get you a few links I can stick afterwards in the comment section. But definitely check out Speak Gaelic as well, which is the new multimedia course for learning the language, because that has a section on classes as well, and it tells you where people are learning. The best one I can say, if I was going to advise anyone, is to check out Solmarostig, the Gaelic college in the Isle of Skye. They have online courses that are excellent. In Cuasa Intrigi, the Access course, and in Cuasa Urstish, the more advanced course for language learning. And they have just started Seachdain, You Yourself Now, which is a conversational class based around these courses. So I'd say definitely check them out because they are wonderful, so helpful, and will do whatever they can for you. Jeff Justice is saying he's struggled with learning Gaelic for years. Nowhere, he's not closer to fluency now than he ever has been, because again, he lives far away, only got the internet. Can I comment on how this is still important to keep Gaelic alive and perhaps offer encouragement to people like him and how you can keep using it? Please, Jeff, yes, keep using Gaelic. It is so important. Everybody counts in Gaeldom, whether you are here in Scotland or not. And for how to use it in your daily life, personally, I talk to myself a lot, not having Gaelic speaking parents, I can't just phone home and speak to somebody there. So if I'm not working in Gaelic, I have a monologue running constantly of what I'm doing. I just talk to myself, I talk out loud. And if you're not at that level yet, Post-it notes, sticky labels on everything with the words that you need to learn, grammar, patterns on the wall, anything that you can do that's going to make you use the language, but pick things that you're interested in. Because if you're interested in fishing, learn words for fish, learn words for equipment, find a link there to you, a commonality, and I think that is the best way to do it. There are quite a lot of Gaelic questions, apologies. We will come to, I promise, Hebrew ones in a minute. Another Gaelic speaker saying, and this is a really important point and quite something you hear an awful lot. Gaelic speaker, native speaker, but not literate. How can you become literate in Gaelic? And it's fascinating as I'm a Jewish convert married to an Israeli with a little tiny bit of Hebrew. Ironically, of course, she can read Hebrew. Which is just put with everything we're saying. I mean, from the Gaelic side of it, Sol Marostig actually run a really good course for native speakers. And it's a course of Scrivi, Scrivi. It's, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but get in touch with them. It's all for fluent speakers who can't write or are rusty at writing. Chili Me is another good course that Ewan Stewart has been running. That's more for Gaelic people that have gone through Gaelic medium that are feeling a bit rusty, but at the same time, it's never going to be a bad thing. But I'd say definitely speak to Sol Marostig because they have an excellent course that is especially for you. Nisha Laser, writing in Hebrew, so I can't read it. I don't know if you can see it, Nivi, at all.
It says, Toda rabba, Nivi, sicha merateket. Thank you, Nivi, fascinating discussion.
Lovely. I guess, hayes na giúnsachig na Gaelic. He's learning Gaelic. It's so few and far between you find somebody that's got both of these languages, and there's two in this one conversation. It's amazing. And unwillingness amongst Gaelic speakers to use a language around non-natives, whereas, as you were saying, Hebrew speakers are happy to loudly use it everywhere. I think it is a question of confidence and being comfortable, as we were saying earlier, just creating situations where people feel that they can comfortably talk to you. And I don't find it that native speakers, it's not they're being rude, it's that they just don't have the confidence and they don't know you. And until they get to know you, sometimes even talking to them in English can be tricky, until they get to know you, because then the doors open and the warmth comes. And, you know, a Gaelic speaker would give you the shirt off their own back. They're the most generous, family, community-minded people you will meet. And I swear, coom or just keep going. Eventually they will break and they will talk to you. But in the meantime, maybe find learners, particularly fluent learners, because we tend to be very enthusiastic and we'll talk to anybody around. So if that is, if you're ever struggling, find particularly fluent learners. I think that is a really important way to do it. I'm seeing another one from Alan here, where on the subject of podcasts and using it in a Gaelic way, there's an example in Hebrew. You're going to have to help me with this one.
Yeah, no, it's transcribed afterwards, little fen, which means to phone.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that a lot. The Hebrew is based on roots and word formation, so it's very easy to take any word from a different language and adapt it. With podcasts specifically, it's a little bit more difficult just because of the sounds of the word. You wouldn't say lefadcast to do a podcast because it just sounds weird in Hebrew. But yeah, in a lot of, like, we do say SMS from SMS, which is to send an SMS. So we're אנחנו מסמסים כל הזמן. And we also we share, like, you normally just use the English word within a sentence. So we are retweeting. אנחנו מרטווטים. This even is a word, although when we say we tweet, we would say אנחנו מצייצים, ציוץ for tweet. Only for retweet, we don't have the word, so אנחנו מרטווטים.
A tweetigoo. We turn it into a Gaelic word, like a hooverigoo. These words that maybe people wouldn't have, we tend to try and put a Gaelic form on them, or sometimes just use the English. It's fascinating. Communication. I'm going to try and keep going through these quickly because I don't want to miss anybody out. But Alistair MacCalpel as a Gaelic speaker, he worries about the high level use of English in some smaller countries like Iceland, the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, etc., and about what this will mean for their native languages in the longer term. Is that an issue in Israel too?
In a sense, yes. Younger people do tend to use a lot of English, whether it's solely English or English mixed with Hebrew. And yeah, there are a lot of people who are worried about the status of Hebrew. In my opinion, it's just the way languages develop. We can't use the same Hebrew that we used 100 years ago. And in 100 years, we will probably won't use the same Hebrew that we're using now. Since it was only revived 150 years ago, it is still developing, and each new generation uses the language differently, and incorporating English is just part of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. You have to move forward. You have to speak a language that people can use. Nisha, Colin West, Gaelic. Given the differences between the two situations, what do you think are the best lessons we can take from Hebrew revival to assist with the revival or strengthening of Gaelic? Are there policies we could adopt at the public level which would assist? I'll maybe go to you first for the public level.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, if an organization decides to use Gaelic as the first language, then all the people within the organization or who want to communicate with this organization will use Gaelic at one point or another. Yeah. It's only a matter of deciding it.
And probably to pick up on that point, it's worth remembering that Parliament Nahalapa, the Scottish Parliament, do have a Gaelic department. Rialtas Nahalapa, they have a Gaelic. Alistair, that's I'm assuming it's the same Alistair MacCallum that was commenting there. He is their Gaelic officer and he is very approachable. So please do contact him. Rialtas Nahalapa, the government, again, have a department for Gaelic and Scots, but also many public bodies have Gaelic plans, and it's always worth looking to see if there's a Gaelic plan there that can be utilised to support the provision of Gaelic materials or to make, in I guess the most brutal form, to make organisations provide services in Gaelic. But Bors na Gaelic Cuideach, if you're ever unsure, do speak to Bors na Gaelic. They are there to help, particularly with this type of thing. And for me, probably the best lesson we can take from Hebrew is just doing it. It shows how that in 30 years, by just going for it and making it part of your life, it can be done. And I think that is really inspiring, even for me, who works with Gaelic and speaks Gaelic as much as I can, to try and use it that wee bit more, particularly maybe with situations where I wouldn't normally use Gaelic. Just a couple more questions here. Another one from Alan. Are you aware that biblical Hebrew sentences, as in Arabic, start with the verb, as in Gaelic? So we are verb, subject, object. I don't know if that's the same for your sentence structure.
In modern Hebrew, not so much. But yeah, in biblical Hebrew, there are additional tenses used and different formation of the sentence. And a lot of times you would see that, yeah.
Yeah, so there might be a connection there. I know there's another question in this chat, but I do remember actually at the beginning in the other chat, I'll have a look at, because Alison did say something earlier about sentence structure, which I'll come back to, because I can't look at two places at once. But Laser has one more question, and I did not know this. He knows of two Gaelic words from Hebrew. Abba, is it for father, and Sabich, well, Sabich for us for the Sabbath. I don't know if there are any other links, but I have a theory that everything came from Gaelic. I don't have lots of evidence to back that up. I claim it every time, but I think it is fascinating when you look at root words and see what was it, Ismisha we had earlier for I am, my name is.
Yeah. But just on those two words, Abba is actually Aramaic and not Hebrew.
Okay.
In Hebrew, it's Av, very similar, but not the same. And the Sabbath you find it in a lot of languages. Sábado in Portuguese as well. Just because it was the day of Sabbath, it became the name of the day itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to very quickly go back to Alison's question from the beginning. Two fascinations of hers, Gaelic and Hebrew, which is wonderful. Surprising common feature in both languages is prepositional pronouns with suffixes for first, second, third persons. And I'm sure people will be interested to hear examples of this in both languages.
That's a bit, nothing comes to mind at the moment. Yeah, we do have a lot of prepositions, prepositional pronouns. We have a lot of suffixes. Yeah, it's definitely there.
Would it be things for, I'm guessing we were talking about, say, like akamsa, for I have, for me, something is at me?
Yeah, but that all the prepositionals can be adjacent to anything, whether it being an adjective, a noun, a pronoun. So sheli is mine, avi is my father, and so on. Yeah, but we can have it separately, like Abba sheli is my father, but also avi is my father.
Interesting. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. One last question is being asked. How many people in Scotland actually speak Gaelic? And it is a good question. I think 62,000 in the last sentence said we're fluent Gaelic speakers, with I think it was 90,000 at the time were saying they had some form of Gaelic. We are going through a census right now, and it's interesting. I mean, for good and bad reasons, which have been debated a lot with Gaelic speakers, they have changed the format. So there is a question in our census right now on your level of English. So I can speak English, very well, quite well, not at all. And that's for speaking, reading, writing, and listening. Whereas it just says, can you speak Gaelic? And it's either yes or no. So the results for the next census should be interesting, as personally, I'm not sure which way it's going to swing. Is it that people who maybe have a little Gaelic go, yes, I know some Gaelic, I'm going to put down that I'm a speaker, or whether people are going to go, oh, I'm not fluent. So they won't put down that they speak Gaelic. So from that side, I would be interested to see what the numbers are like in the next census, because I don't know why it was changed not to give a more detailed breakdown of language capabilities. I think we would all have rathered that, but hey ho, this is what we have, and I do hope that everybody who can put down that they have a Gaelic capability does so. Unfortunately, the time is running on us. Otherwise, I would have loved to have talked to you for longer. Thank you so much. Thank you to Efrat who did the introduction at the beginning. But Nivi, on behalf of all the Gaelic speakers that are listening, thank you so much. It's been fascinating to learn about your language. So inspiring, and I really hope that Gaelic will follow a similar path in the future, and who knows, in 10 years time we could be doing this conversation again with more positive results to report. And thank you to everybody who set this up and was part of Seachdain Gaelic. Táir a takars tron Seachdains mar sin na cumsih clós riclasneach halárach lína cén le torfistricate mas vigeri sin einamach min takars this ile. Just a wee reminder that Seachdain Gaelic is running all the way to Sunday. Lots of information to be found, lots of events on our website www.seachdainagaelic.scot. So do check that out. And last one, Kiat Milatang, thank you very much to Simon, who's doing all the technical side of it behind the scenes. But to Chloe and Christina as well, who were involved in organising this. Kiat Milatang, thank you all very much. Agus hamin dochas go be eiche va a go bhfuile. Céad an drast. Thank you.